The collapse of tourism globally is a problem which you're all very familiar with. And while there are many, and more coming out of the woodwork all the time, many energetic and many successful initiatives to raise money, grants, loans, and so on for some wildlife areas, for law enforcement in some cases, and for some safari operators, there's been much less focus on supporting the rural community stakeholders who are, at the end of the day, the custodians of the landscape and the wildlife on which this tourism depends. We think that a collaborative platform can address this shortcoming while also amplifying existing fundraising approaches. It is not an alternative, and it is not in any way competitive. A diverse and eclectic African community speaking with one voice has a chance of pushing this issue, the demise of tourism and its impacts on nature conservation, local communities and businesses. It can be pushed up the global agenda, where we have to be aware it is competing with health, education, industrial output, food security, jobs, and even sport and music. We are not alone suffering from COVID-19. The platform we'd like to discuss today would not interfere with any present or future initiatives, and we think it could be designed to be broad enough to encompass all different types of people, whether they're private sector or community-based, because everybody needs help to survive this disruption. You'll see from the document that we circulated that we envisaged a three-phase approach, which started with the need for emergency relief for the crisis, followed and overlapping with a stimulus package, probably for 3 to 5 years, to help rural communities, businesses, and the conservation community through what, frankly, is likely to be a long and slow recovery. And then third, we need to be looking to the future to develop resilience in the system in future, and that might involve the exploration of new business models for wildlife-rich Africa. Some people who are at this meeting have coined this relief, recovery, and rebuild, which I think is very apt. And on this note, I must add here that much of what we are suggesting is not new. And we've borrowed heavily from friends. I see some of you on the screen now, but I will mention in particular the Nature Conservancy, WWF, AWF, UNDP, Maliasili, JAMA International, Resource Africa, Wilderness Holdings, Conservation Capital, all our friends in Namibia, and many others who have contributed to our thinking on this. Thank you very much to all of you, and I'm sorry if I didn't name you. The three groups of activity that we've described are to a greater or lesser extent already going on, either in practice or in some cases in design. But we think they would all benefit from collaborative data sharing, consensus building, the co-production of strategies, plans, budgets, and the allocation of responsibilities. Because a siloed function by function approach is not likely to achieve the results we want to see fast enough or at the scale that we need. This is why we are promoting the development of an open collaborative platform for knowledge sharing, research, data development, planning, communication. A platform that can help marshal resources, people, and ideas and develop good operating practices. It's got to be a platform that can act fast and secure the space and the voice that we need. It needs to bring transparency to this marketplace. It can build a collective brand and generate the excitement that is needed to meet our targets. But time is short. So this is a call to action. African communities, companies, and organizations may have no tourists, but they have skills and assets, and they're grounded, innovative, and committed. So the question is, how can they be helped to help themselves and to help others out of this mess? Frankly, the way the world is currently structured, we're more likely to see stimulus packages go to the airlines to bring tourists to Africa than to the people who are involved in nature conservation and on whom that tourism depends. So we're asking, can we go on a walk together? Can we go on a walk together to build a community that facilitates learning and dialogue and cooperation that will make the necessary investments possible? Can we bring together a broad community with people of different interests? Interest in communities and community rights, interest in nature conservation and in specific places, as well as people involved of tourism services of all stripes. I believe that we can put a wrapper around all of this and make it possible for people to invest with confidence. Before I exit the door and open up the meeting further, let me end by expressing some ambition through some figures. I've seen proposals so far, some of them sent in by you, looking for support of 20,000 US dollars, 2 million US dollars, and around about 20 million US dollars. Now that's great. But on the other hand, and you'll probably hear this a little later, the African Development Bank is looking at a 10 billion fund for food security. And the African Union is trying to put together 100 billion for an economic stimulus package. But none of this is earmarked for nature, and none of it is earmarked for communities who are bearing the costs of living with wildlife in the hope and expectation of some kind of financial reward. So I think we should be talking collectively about a call for $1 billion minimum for this sector. And the way to do this is through a collaborative platform. So in conclusion, we would like to help investors, lenders, and donors recognize the critical importance of this sector, the conservation areas, the ecotourism operators, and the rural stakeholders who support this. But top of mind for me personally is that we need to deliver jobs, purpose, and hope for very, very critical rural communities in Africa.
Well, let me share a few thoughts about why these issues that are being discussed for the platform matter to me personally and to the organization I work for, the United Nations Environment Programme. I grew up in a small town called Kadoma in Zimbabwe. My mother was a greengrocer selling tomatoes to make ends meet. And during school holidays, I would join her journeys through the suburbs, a big dish of tomatoes on my head, and we would knock on doors of a regular and trusted customers for supplies. She put food on the table, her customers and ours. She kept a little book with copious notes on her customers, including product preferences, consumption patterns, balance owing, and so on. She probably hoped to live in a big house like the ones we sold to in mostly white, affluent neighborhoods. But her business was built around sourcing tomatoes from farms, storing them at home, and delivering by foot. So that meant that her reach was limited and her potential wealth was capped. And times were hard, and they were getting harder in the 80s, especially for a woman. The economy was shrinking, the local currency had lost value, and as conflicts intensified within the Zimbabwe military and so-called dissidents, it became dangerous to source tomatoes or even to deliver to her customers. By the time the conflict had subsided, the big supermarket chains had taken over. Now, I take inspiration from my mother's story when I look at the state of conservation in Africa today. She persevered and progressed with with the resources that she had until she no longer could. So too have communities in Africa who live with wildlife. And now, like my mother then, and so many of us today, they face a defining moment. Like my mother, the communities who live with wildlife work hard, but are hardly noticed. Although they have kept the conservation world alive, now that disaster has struck, they are all but invisible. And a major source of their income, wildlife tourism, has evaporated. Many are destitute and may have little alternative but to turn to unregulated and unsustainable extraction of wild resources to survive. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where we've got to. It doesn't have to be where we stay. And our conversation today could be the game changer that communities need. We are here to develop an open, collaborative platform for identifying hard problems and assembling the expertise that allow us to learn about these problems deeply and to invest in whatever it takes to solve those problems. We must succeed. And I'll tell you why we must succeed, as John has already alluded to. Across Africa, 70% of wildlife, especially elephant range, is outside of protected areas. It thrives on communal lands and on private lands because people want it. But living with wildlife comes at a cost. For most communities and private landowners, tourism incomes have been used to offset that cost. Today, that income has dried up. The industry is in distress and needs help. So it is imperative to include poor communities in our calculus of stimulus packages today. And we need new ways of thinking. Rural African communities face an endless string of obstacles to doing business. They are finding it difficult to build representative, community-based enterprises to deliver commercial outcomes. It is time to genuinely empower them to play a role in the development of wildlife economies and commerce. And that includes the issues that we've been dealing with and most of you have been grappling with around giving them rights to wildlife and resources and greater equity and stake in related businesses. This year, it will be 15 years since my mother passed on. Now I recognize how brilliant a businesswoman my mother was. But at a certain point, she faced formidable odds. The challenges faced by poor rural communities today are even more daunting. It is not their problem alone to solve. Saving wildlife is a common goal, but the cost of doing so cannot be borne by communities alone. We all have a responsibility and must commit to their cause. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John, and hi, everyone. Like Max, let me also start with a personal story. I was born into wildlife. My father was the head of national parks when I was growing up in Uganda. So I was already owed by at the time I started working in this sector, I was already owed by the aesthetic value of wildlife and the beauty of all the wildlife. And Max has already talked about what tourism has done for Africa. I think one point that I think is not getting a lot of attention is also how much tourism, the revenue from tourism has a vast multiplier effect in the national economies. So when you talk about jobs, when you say that we're competing with jobs and we're competing with health and education, tourism receipts pay for that. They come in, money from tourism goes into the national economies and is able to pay for things like that. But we're not talking about that now. We seem to see that it's a competition, but it's not. The money that is coming from tourism is also supporting that. And obviously, as WWF, we are as concerned as everyone else, and we are contributing to emergency response. We are mapping the impacts and engaging with governments to work on stimulus and to make sure tourism has the attention of the stimulus packages. But one thing that has also occurred to us is this big focus on tourism may have overshadowed the broader benefits of nature itself. Even when there are no tourists visiting the park, nature itself has an existential value. All the broader benefits that it contributes to our health and well-being, whether it's the water towers, whether it's food security, pollinators, soil fertility, health, important genetic material and traditional medicine. We've tried to do this in the past through natural capital accounting and mainstreaming in nature into policy and development frameworks, but we still have a long way to go, especially when you see that we're not talking about it now, and the true value of nature in itself is not coming through in the conversation. We seem to be lamenting a lot about tourism, and rightly so, but we are not talking about all the other values on its own that it contributes. And I think the point made earlier is to recognize the fact that we don't want all the support to go to the hotels and the tour operators and forget the communities that are also stewards of this. So I see an important role for the platform, John. As you mentioned earlier, bringing our collective voice to talk about these issues and to advocate better, I think, for nature and nature beyond tourism, and also to share, to advocate and to share knowledge with everyone else and everybody who's outside of our sector on this role. Thank you, over.
Hi, John. Yes, all clear. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Just very briefly, for those that aren't familiar with the work of Boundless Southern Africa, we provide technical tourism market development support to the transfrontier conservation areas of Southern Africa. Both the SADC program for TFCAs and the recently approved SADC tourism program specifically articulate the development of TFCAs into marketable regional tourism products with tangible spin-offs for the promotion of regional integration, cooperative tourism, and rural development. Our unit is hosted by the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries in South Africa and has been hosted since 2008. In May 2000, the Kgalagadi Transfrontier Park became Africa's first transfrontier park, and we were going to have a whole 20-year celebration. The advent of COVID-19 obviously radically changed how we are able to celebrate such a milestone. And we've come up with a virtual celebration for 20 days to celebrate this due to the opportunities that we have on social media platforms. And we've been able to support the national TFCA focal points from Botswana and South Africa to coordinate such a program with support from Botswana Tourism Organization, the Botswana Department of Wildlife and National Parks, South African National Parks, and South African Tourism. So this has forced us to think differently and come up with very different ways of approaching things. We've also recently supported the development of a number of proposals that were submitted for the UNWTO World Health Organization Healing Solutions for Tourism Challenge. Here the proposals had to be innovative, provide value-added solutions, have a tested pilot, and have the potential to be applied in many countries. Unfortunately, no proposals from Africa made the shortlist of 29 entries. But each of the proposals that I was working on have excellent examples of innovations from organizations and small tourism businesses in our protected landscapes. And I firmly believe that many of the solutions that we have are very applicable across all our landscapes, protected area landscapes and communities across the continent. An example is a dynamic digital tourism destination platform and marketing campaign for the Victoria Falls Regional Tourism Organization, which has seen more than 14 global partners committing more than $100,000 worth of services pro bono to support Victoria Falls as a destination, both on the Zambia and the Zimbabwe side. All my engagements over the last 2 months with different sized tourism and wildlife economy businesses and a wide range of organizations make it very clear that we'll only get through this crisis through a collective effort that is evidence-based in a very fluid environment. The platform could support the collation of high-level guidelines distilled from the flood of information available, which is quite dizzying, on a range of critical interventions for implementation at the landscape level. Critical factors that need to be addressed at scale and virtually simultaneously are support for tourism enterprises and communities in and around protected areas through the establishment of a financing platform that injects short-term liquidity into conservation landscapes and builds a viable investment vehicle for longer term private investment. By supporting critical liquidity constraints, tourism enterprises and their temporarily laid off staff should be able to focus then on providing critical public goods in their communities during the immediate stabilization phase until a recovery phase commences. And this could be part of the argument and building the case that we should be making. Such activities include supporting credible COVID-19 related information dissemination, supporting food and water security in communities, investing in skills development, and identifying new supply chain linkages that can be developed and expanded when tourism flow returns. This could strengthen protected areas as catalysts for inclusive rural economic development. Also, we need to identify technological innovations for optimal impact of inequality and poverty alleviation, operations in protected area landscapes, and also digital destination platforms that profile the nature, culture, and community products equally and facilitate more inclusive tourism value chains. And finally, to use this opportunity to position protected area landscapes as anchors of environmental sustainability and drivers of an equitable transition to a low carbon economy. I think all of those points make for a very compelling case to be made with very clear outcomes. And at the end of the day, we need to be able to ensure that benefit flows flow to both the environment and to our people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Maxi Lewis and I'm from Namibia, and I work for an organization that is a network that deals with around conservancies. There's a program called the CBNRM program, and there's communities that we support in conservancies. We have around 86 of these conservancies all over the country. This is outside protected areas. I will start, John asked me to just give you a little bit of a case study in terms of what is happening with tourism in Namibia, especially regarding tourism in rural areas. And just as a background, our tourism sector contributes around 10.9% of the GDP to the Namibian economy. Tourism accounts around 15.75% of total employment in Namibia, creating employment throughout the country, but also generating economic activities and economic upliftment in all corners of the country. The tourism sector is the largest contributor of foreign reserves in our country. The tourism taxpayer, and this is also an industry that is very well organized. We have roughly around 2,000 accommodation establishments, and this is registered with our Namibia Tourism Board. And we have around 1,400 companies that are in business of tour packaging. Within those accommodation establishments, we have around 61 joint venture partnerships with the communities, and all of this is in rural areas. And we also have hunting, around 41 plus minus hunting contracts in conservancies and in communal areas. So if you consider the lives of Namibians currently, within the epidemic and what is happening currently, is that 1 in 5 Namibians is dependent on the tourism industry for jobs. This is overall in Namibia. But many of these jobs in rural areas where each individual employment affects at least 7 additional people, most especially when you look in rural areas, this is even that will actually increase. So let me just come to rural Namibia to give you a picture at the moment. In rural Namibia, conservancy incomes from tourism, and this is our 2018 figures, from tourism, which is photographic and also hunting operations, is approximately around 60 million per year, with an additional 65 million paid in salaries of the tourism staff living in these conservancies. Tourism is the principal economic force in conservancies and in rural areas, and pays for the conservation of protection costs in our conservation areas. And at the moment, it's particularly very hard hit. Namibia's tourism industry estimates there will be 0 tourist arrivals in the country for the next 3 to 4 months, and it could also be longer. Just one minute. And this situation is, for us, it will persist maybe for another year and longer, as I said. The predictions for the loss of income and massive job losses in this sector are particularly painful in rural areas where the majority of our population ekes out a subsistence living, which has been seriously weakened by because we're just coming from a drought of around 7 years, and this drought has continued, especially in the northwestern part and the southern part of the country where we have the majority of our communities residing. At the same time, there are significant job losses in urban areas, and large numbers of this unemployment are already migrating back to their extended families in rural areas, creating a vicious cycle of increased need and dwindling income that is leading to more pressure on the environment, and especially in our conservation areas. The joint venture partnership tourism businesses are now forced to close. It will take years to recover, and the cost to individuals and rural communities and the nation will be much more greater than the short-term impact and investment required to make sure that the industry can bridge this crisis. So what have we done so far? As been mentioned before, our government has been very proactive also in coming up with stimulate packages, but a lot of these stimulate packages are also very much challenging because they are not addressing a lot of the needs that these tourism industry partners need, especially in our rural areas. We from the conservation side have also set up some facilities to try and address and prioritize areas where our conservation activities are taking place, paying salaries of our game guards that are the frontliners in terms of conservation and protection of our wildlife in these areas. So this is what we have done so far, but this is very much over a short period, and we are also looking for some additional funding to do so. Lastly, why is this platform very important for us? When I look at it from a tourism point of view, in Southern Africa, we have just started opening up, trying to do tourism very much on the landscape level, and that will also include our communities that are in transboundary projects, and at the moment they will also be heavily impacted. So rather than just looking at it as a Namibian problem, we would like to look at it as an African problem, but also a Southern African problem. Thank you so much. I hope I was within my 5 minutes.
Good to meet everybody on this call. So maybe I can add a little bit of value from the perspective of the UN system, just to get everybody on to speed as to what's happening within the United Nations system in terms of the response to COVID and the relevance to what John has introduced. So I don't know whether you're aware, but there are essentially 3 different arms or 3 different tracks, if you like, to the United Nations multilateral response to COVID-19. One is, of course, the humanitarian response effort, which colleagues in UN OCHA are leading. There is the sort of the preparedness and response plan, which is health related, that our colleagues in WHO are leading. And the one that is perhaps less familiar to all of you, because it's just been launched, it's what's referred to as the United Nations Socioeconomic Framework Response, which is essentially led by the resident coordinator system within the UN Secretariat, with the technical lead being UNDP, which is where I sit. Now, I happen to also be the director of Nature, Climate, and Energy at UNDP. And of course, for us, from where we sit, it is incredibly important that the recovery phase, stimulus discussions, etc., put at the center of it nature, climate, and energy, not because it's an option, because there is no other option, but to put it at the center. And therefore, we're mobilizing very strongly to ensure that that indeed happens through the various networks that we're engaging with at different levels, but certainly most importantly at the country level. Now, in that context, I think there are already a number of platforms that we have introduced in the past, including one which some of you may be familiar with, the Green Commodities platform, which we think is really an important part of the overall solution to ensure that the issues that we're all concerned about certainly are retained and maintained at a level which does reach the ears of those policymakers that ultimately do have to take action. And it does prove to be a wonderful way in which a collective action certainly can be advanced and promoted to see the kinds of changes that we want to see. And we're very much supportive of it. And, you know, certainly, as I mentioned to John yesterday, we'd welcome a further conversation on what exactly that needs to look like and how we can support it from where we sit. So I very much look forward to the outcomes of the breakout discussion today. But beyond that, I think it's also important that, and certainly this has also been a preoccupation for most of us, is how do we respond to the immediate needs of many of the communities, particularly in the informal and marginal areas that are not going to immediately reap the benefits of whatever assistance that is currently being discussed through larger programs. It will take time for them to reach those outer communities. And in that context, we've been discussing a lot internally about ways in which, you know, we can rely on social protection programs, but perhaps with a little bit of a tweak to ensure that they are also geared towards nature, climate outcomes that we'd all like to see. And we urgently recognize the need for, you know, how can we get some of those things going? And we've already started discussions with several donors to design some of those programs and get them operational very quickly. In fact, just before this call, I was on a long conversation with the Green Climate Fund about putting solar panels on health clinics across a number of countries to prepare them for the eventual time when a vaccine is available, because storage will become an important matter and you need energy for that. But in the context of the constituents that we're talking about here, tourism, wildlife, etc., there certainly is a large platform of initiatives that UNDP is already engaged with our partners, including the Global Environment Facility and others that we can leverage and hopefully build upon. So I very much look forward to doing that. One important initiative that I do want to mention, and our head of biodiversity, Midori Paxton, is on this call, and I'm sure Midori will say more during the conversation today, has to do with our current program called the Lion's Share. I don't know whether, I'm sure some of you are aware of it, but this is a grant-making scheme aimed at supporting communities in wildlife-rich areas, and we've received, as part of our first call, an overwhelming number of submissions. I think about 1,700 proposals in less than 4 weeks. Around 55% of them are from Africa, and requesting about $70 million worth of support for various initiatives. And we're currently working our way through our Rolodex of donors to try and match financing to some of what those requests are about. I think, you know, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's going to be a lot more that needs to be done. John, 1 billion is ambitious, but I don't think it's anywhere near enough. I think we got to go more. And in fact, there will be a lot more that will be required, and certainly is in the pipeline through a number of initiatives that ourselves and certainly our partners around the table and beyond are working on, which somehow we need to connect and connect the dots on. So I very much look forward to engaging in a conversation with all of you on that. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you again, John, and the Luc Hoffmann Institute for initiating this important process. I come from the African Leadership University, and the work that we do is develop the next generation of leaders. So our hope is to train young people to solve Africa's problems, and we have the School of Wildlife Conservation as one of the initiatives within our umbrella. And with that, we hope to create the next generation of African conservation leaders who can carry on the great work that so many of you have done, for the continent of Africa. So that's really the work that we do. And I agree with a lot of the sentiments that I shared here. So maybe if I can add one additional perspective. One thing that I really believe is that constraints drive innovation. And we are right now in a very constrained environment with limited resources. And so what I want to encourage all of us to do as we think about the short-term interventions that are needed to support communities today, love to encourage us to also use this moment to really think through how we build long-term business models that are more sustainable and less dependent on tourism. How do we think about diversified revenue streams that go beyond tourism and that are not dependent on donors, so that we can really think differently and ensure that when there's another crisis, we have diversified revenue streams that can allow us to be able to sustain our communities and the wildlife that they live with today. So I wanted to share a few ways in which we could contribute as this initiative goes forward. First is in the area of data. I think it's critically important that we have data that really gives us a sense of this wildlife economy that we're talking about, such that right now, when there's a moment like this, do we know how many jobs are at stake? How much tax is being contributed because of the wildlife economy? How much foreign exchange is the continent earning, etc. There's a scarcity of data around the wildlife economy, and so one of the things that we're doing, Sue Snyman, who's on this call, is leading a project. It's a long-term research project that we're doing at the university to study the wildlife economy, so that we can really bring a fact base to this discussion and to be able to enable policy makers, et cetera, to give, unfortunately, policymakers in Africa tend to think not in terms of nature, but in terms of jobs and taxes and policy. And so how do we take the fact base to them to be able to shape the way they think, so that we can actually see wildlife as one of our greatest assets as a continent that can really help to develop and provide livelihood for our communities. The second contribution that we'd like to make is, some of you may know about the Business of Conservation conference that we do every year, which is really trying to bring investors, government, the media, etc., to the table to see wildlife as an asset, as an incredible asset that Africa has and that it needs to invest in, and so that it can actually be a pillar of economic development and not be a consequence of development. And we've historically done that in September. We're going to be moving it online this year, unfortunately, because of COVID. And we want to offer that platform as a way to create awareness, both in Africa and globally, around this issue. And we've been able to create an influential group of people with resources that could possibly invest in, whether philanthropically or with more commercial capital to try to support some of the businesses that exist within the sector. So that's we're looking at making the theme of this year's conference, which is an online conference, all being around the need for the stimulus package, etc. The third thing that we can offer is capacity building. We think there's a need now more than ever for conservationists to be able to speak the language of business, to be able to explain to potential investors why they should put capital in their safari lodge, or why a community at a national level, why a government's part of their budget should go towards investing in communities so that the country can think slightly longer term. We've got to be able to talk in the language of economics and politics to the decision makers who can actually allocate capital. And so we'd like to run a series of webinars, et cetera, with people in the sector to be able to learn how to pitch properly and develop relations with investors and be able to articulate the value of wildlife, et cetera. And the fourth thing is, can we leverage our network to help to possibly secure some capital for the sector? Because there are some people that have over the last few years joined our Business of Conservation community who are investors, who, you know, if something is packaged properly, might be able to support. And so we'd love to see how we can help and to connect possibly some, you know, some of those players with those who need capital. And then finally, talent. We've got a lot of young people who are very talented, who are passionate about the sector. So if any of you are looking for, you know, sharp young interns who can assist you in doing some analysis or helping to put together presentations, you know, we have some young people that would love to work with you. So these are different ways that, you know, we hope we can contribute and help this initiative. But thank you again for inviting us onto this call.